Let's use our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model to think through about the effects of Brexit on the macroeconomy in the United Kingdom. So voters in the UK decided last week that in a referendum that the United Kingdom should leave the European Union. The European Union is an association of European states that provides for a free movement of people and of capital and a harmonized regulatory environment and some fiscal taxation and redistribution across the member countries. So the UK voters decided to leave. They'd been participating in the European project, the common market, and that developed into the European Union for the last 20 or 30 years, and in a about face, perhaps because of immigration concerns, the voters decided to instruct the government to leave. So that produced an immediate drop in stock market valuations around the world, a sharp fall in the value of the British pound on international exchange markets, and a big political debate, resignation of the sitting Prime Minister David Cameron. So lots of effects of that in this first week since Brexit was announced, and whether those effects are going to last or not, we don't know. But let's assume, for purposes of macroeconomic modeling, that they do last, and in particular, let's assume that there's three kinds of possible effects. One kind of effect is a pretty significant and longer-term increase in uncertainty about the regulatory structure, about immigration, and hence the labor market, about trade policies, in particular for England. And that kind of uncertainty then leads to declines in consumer expenditures and in particular to declines in business investment. So you can imagine a business that's thinking of building a large site, an industrial site or something like that. If it doesn't know what the regulatory environment is for pollution, for health and safety of workers, for the duration of this building, the next 10, 20 years, it might decide, well, let's just hold off until we have a new regulatory structure here in place in Britain that's going to replace this harmonized EU regulatory structure. So business investment, we might think, would decline. Likewise, consumer durables might decline. People don't know whether they should buy a car now, given that there's more uncertainty about the way the British economy is going to go. Hold off buying refrigerators. So big consumption items, there might be a decrease in spending. So these are all things that would shift the AD curve to the left in our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Now, something else that might shift the aggregate demand curve to the left is this uncertainty leads to distrust of the financial system. So British people start thinking, oh, this Brexit might generate a lot of uncertainty. I don't really trust the banks anymore, especially after Northern Rock nearly collapsed back in the financial crisis, and so I'm going to start withdrawing funds from my bank account and buying gold and keeping it buried in my home. So we might think that there's a financial crisis that might result. We might think also that banks themselves decide to reduce their lending and increase their capital. And if everybody does that, if all the banks do that, then it's a self-reinforcing process, because then investment spending declines, which means GDP declines, which means banks become less profitable, which means that people start getting more worried about the soundness of their deposits in the banks, and so they start withdrawing their funds from the banks. So we can have a financial crisis at the same time as we're having this reduction in aggregate demand. So that's sort of our bad scenario, is a big shift to the left of the aggregate demand curve in England. Now, there's another effect that I think was somewhat unanticipated, which was a very sharp drop in the value of the pound. And whether that persists or not, we don't know. Certainly, if there's this big increase in uncertainty and there's a big recession, then we might expect the pound to fall. And so the market seemed to be anticipating that there might be now a much higher risk of recession. And so the pound starts declining immediately The value of the pound in the present is determined by the expected future value of the pound. So if the British economy is expected to be less strong, to grow more slowly than it has, or even to decline, the pound will be worth less in the future, so it declines immediately today. Now that decline in the pound has two effects in our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. One is that it increases net exports, so that offsets to some degree this shift of the aggregate demand curve to the left, because an increase in net export shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. We're going to assume that this effect is really small for now. And we're going to focus instead on another effect, which is the drop in the pound. Britain consumers purchase a lot of imports from the continent, from the United States, so the drop in the value of the pound raises the prices of all those imports. So it's like a price shock. We have an increase in inflation. I shouldn't have written expected inflation here. We have that rho term in the aggregate supply curve. So this is a shift up of the aggregate supply curve. So the aggregate supply curve shifts up. So now let's trace through these two possible changes. I'm not going to do them simultaneously because that'll get complicated in the graph. We'll just do them separately. So let's first consider a shift in the aggregate demand curve, the short run, long run, and then a shift in the aggregate supply curve, the short run and the long run. So if we have the aggregate demand curve shifting to the left, and maybe it shifts actually quite a bit with the financial crisis in Britain, so we get a new equilibrium with a much lower level of GDP, so GDP falls, and a lower level of inflation because economic activity is falling. We're moving along the aggregate supply curve. More and more people are becoming unemployed, and they're not in a position to demand higher wages. In fact, they start working at lower wages, and so we get a reduction in inflation in the economy. That's a movement along our aggregate supply curve, and we end up at this level of equilibrium in the short run. Now, over the longer run, because inflation has gone down, the aggregate supply curve shifts down because expected inflation goes down. We've had lower inflation than we were used to, maybe even deflation, so the aggregate supply curve shifts down. So the aggregate supply curve shifts down. As the aggregate supply curve shifts down, GDP then moves up a little bit. Inflation continues to drop, but not as much, right? So the aggregate supply curve, expected inflation now is, actual inflation was lower, so expected inflation shifts down again, so the aggregate supply curve shifts again, and the aggregate supply curve will just keep shifting to the right, and we'll keep moving to new equilibrium until we're back at potential GDP. And once we're at potential GDP, then inflation is going to be equal to expected inflation, and we're not going to have any change in the aggregate supply curve. So the way the economy moves following this shock is GDP declines a lot, inflation goes down a lot, and when we have sort of a long recession that lasts maybe several years until the economy finally gets back to potential with a lower level of GDP. So that's the aggregate demand shock with no policy response, right? The government could respond by an expansionary fiscal policy, so the aggregate demand curve shifted back. If the government responds with an aggressive fiscal policy, that would offset this aggregate demand shock. But the government in Britain is currently a conservative government. They're not likely to do that. Let's turn to the aggregate supply curve very quickly. So the exchange rate leads to a shock to inflation. Aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. So what we have is a decrease in GDP. GDP falls. And an increase in inflation. Inflation rises. So that shift in the aggregate supply curve is happening because that rho, that shock to the exchange rate shifts. In the next period, then that shock is no longer there. That goes back to zero. So inflation is higher. So expected inflation is higher. So the aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left relative to what it used to be, but to the right relative to the one that's represented with the big price shock. So we might have something like this, and so we started in. We jumped to that equilibrium, and then we're going to move along the aggregate demand curve over time. When inflation comes under control because we have unemployment, we have GDP levels here below potential, so inflation gradually comes back down, so we end up at our earlier equilibrium. So we have a stagflation situation where GDP is below potential and prices are continuing to rise. So the central bank isn't meeting its inflation target during this period. And there's no divine coincidence of wants here, so there's really a tough position for the Bank of England, which either has to allow more inflation to counteract this shock, or has to have an even deeper recession in order to prevent inflation from rising.